crystalline spires of the Intergalactic Academy of Ethical Studies pierced through the verdant canopy of Viridia IV's ancient forests. Morning mist clung to the bases of the towers, giving the entire structure an ethereal quality that matched its lofty purpose. Within these walls, representatives from dozens of civilizations across the known galaxy gathered to wrestle with questions that had plagued sentient beings since the dawn of consciousness. What is right? What is wrong? And in the crucible of war, how does one maintain their soul? Nina Reyes stood at the observation deck of the Academy's central tower, watching the twin suns of Viridia rise through the mist. She was conspicuously alone among the clusters of alien students who chatted in their various languages, their forms ranging from the gossamer-winged Etherians to the rock-like granites. As the only human in her cohort, Nina had grown accustomed to solitude, but it was a solitude born of choice rather than exclusion. She preferred the quiet moments before classes began, when she could gather her thoughts and prepare for another day of being the sole voice of a species many still viewed with suspicion. The scars on her left arm tingled in the morning humidity, a reminder of Earth's last resource wars that had shaped her childhood. Unlike the visible marks, the deeper wounds were carried in memory, the sound of fusion bombs in the distance, the taste of recycled air in underground bunkers, the weight of her mother's rifle when she taught Nina how to defend their island settlement. These experiences set her apart from her classmates, many of whom came from civilizations that had achieved peace centuries ago, their wars relegated to historical study rather than living memory. Nina Reyes. A melodious voice interrupted her reverie. She turned to see Lysara, a Vorthian whose translucent skin revealed the complex neural patterns beneath, literally wearing her thoughts for all to see. Chancellor Irval has called an assembly. Something about a new assignment. Nina nodded, falling into step beside the taller being. The halls of the academy were themselves a marvel of bioengineering, with walls that breathed and floors that absorbed sound, creating an atmosphere of perpetual calm. Living crystal archives lined the corridors, dormant now but capable of projecting the memories of those who touched them, turning personal history into shared experience. It was said that the Academy's founders believed true understanding could only come from walking in another's memories. The assembly hall was already filling when they arrived. At the center of the amphitheater, Chancellor Irval undulated gently in his aqueous habitat, his 6 limbs creating patterns in the water that served as a form of emphasis for his telepathically broadcast words. The cephalod was ancient even by galactic standards, his consciousness spanning centuries of poppies of ethical deliberation. Students of ethics, the Chancellor's thoughts rippled through their minds like gentle waves. Today marks the beginning of your most challenging assignment yet, the War Ethics Report. A rustle of anticipation swept through the gathered beings. Nina noticed Targun, a Bovary whose warrior culture was legendary throughout the galaxy, straightened with obvious interest. His forearms flexed unconsciously, a sign of excitement among his people. Each of you will prepare a comprehensive analysis of war ethics. Chancellor Irval continued, his mental voice carrying undertones of both sorrow and hope. You may choose historical conflicts, theoretical scenarios, or strategic doctrines. What matters is not the scope of your chosen subject, but the depth of your ethical reasoning. Professor Dragox stepped forward, her scales shimmering with the deep red of authority. The Draconid matriarch commanded respect through sheer presence, her culture having perfected the art of war over millennia before choosing the path of teaching rather than conquest. Your reports will be judged not merely on academic merit, she announced, her voice a controlled rumble, but on their practical application. Ethics without action is merely philosophy. We seek wisdom that can prevent the next war, not simply analyze the last. As the assembly dispersed, Nina's mind was already working. Her classmates would likely choose the grand conflicts that shaped galactic history, the Andromedan Unification Wars, the machine uprising of Kepler-42, the century of silence when entire sectors ceased communication rather than risk conflict. But Nina's thoughts turned inward, to a different kind of history. 3 weeks passed in a blur of research and introspection. The Academy's libraries, both physical and digital, hummed with activity as students dove into historical records, military treatises, and philosophical texts. Nina, however, spent her time differently. She sat in her dormitory room, surrounded not by books but by holographic projections of faces. Her family tree spread across the walls like a constellation of human experience, each point of light representing a life lived, choices made, ethics tested in the crucible of survival. Her great-grandmother, Maria Reyes, stared back at her from a photograph taken in 2089, just before the First Water War. A teacher turned refugee coordinator. Maria had established the underground schools that kept education alive during the darkest years. Next to her glowed the image of Uncle Marcus, whose refusal to fire on unarmed civilians during the Battle of Meridian City had cost him his commission but saved his soul. Her mother, Eleanor, appeared in multiple images, as a young medic, as a tired soldier, as the woman who risked court-martial to treat enemy wounded during the siege of New Tokyo. Each face told a story, and each story posed a question about the nature of ethics in warfare. Were there universal principles that transcended species and culture, or was morality as varied as the beings who practiced it? Nina wrestled with these questions as she compiled her report, choosing an unconventional format that she knew would challenge expectations. The day of submission arrived with the characteristic efficiency of academy scheduling. Students filed into the submission chamber, where their reports would be uploaded into the living archives for review. Nina watched as her classmates presented thick volumes of analysis, strategic assessments backed by centuries of military theory, case studies that dissected conflicts with surgical precision. When her turn came, she stepped forward with a single data crystal and a brief cover letter. Understanding war begins with understanding why my ancestors fought or fled. She had written, I submit not an analysis of distant battles, but the ethical legacy of the Reyes family tree, spanning 5 generations of human conflict and conscience. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Zephyr, an Etherian whose species communicated through color shifts in their translucent wings, flashed patterns of confusion and surprise. Targan's laugh was a short bark of derision. A family tree, he scoffed. This is not a genealogy class. Human. But it was Professor Dragox's reaction that cut deepest. The Draconid's eyes narrowed, her tail lashing once in a gesture of dismissal. A family tree is not a battle plan. Nina Reyes, how does this serve the study of war ethics? Nina stood her ground, though her heart raced. With respect, Professor, every battle plan is ultimately executed by individuals with families, histories, and personal ethics. Understanding war means understanding warriors. And understanding warriors means understanding what shaped them. Chancellor Yerval's tentacles moved in what Nina had learned was contemplation. An interesting perspective. We shall see how it stands up to scrutiny. Class discussions begin tomorrow. That night, Nina barely slept. She knew her unconventional approach would face resistance, but she believed in the power of personal narrative to illuminate universal truths. Her family's story was not unique in its suffering, but in its documentation, in the careful preservation of individual choices made in impossible circumstances. The next morning's discussion began with traditional presentations. Korvax, a silicon-based life form from the outer rings, presented an analysis of resource allocation during siege warfare, complete with mathematical models that reduced casualties to statistical probabilities. The class nodded appreciatively at the elegant equations, though Nina noticed Lysara's neural patterns flickering with what seemed like discomfort. When Nina's turn came, she stood before the assembly with quiet determination. Instead of charts and statistics, She activated the room's memory projection system. The first image that materialized was not a battlefield, but a kitchen, cramped and worn, where her great-great-grandmother fed refugees with whatever she could grow in hidden gardens. The Battle of Meridian City. 2127, Nina began, her voice steady despite the skeptical looks from some classmates. Military historians record it as a tactical victory for the Northern Alliance. What they don't record is this moment. The projection shifted, showing a young man in uniform standing at a checkpoint, weapon lowered. My great-uncle Marcus received orders to fire on a convoy of refugees suspected of harboring enemy combatants. He had 30 seconds to decide between following orders and following conscience. And he chose insubordination. Targon interjected, his tone dismissive. In Bovary culture, such weakness would bring shame to his entire clan. He chose to investigate first, Nina corrected calmly. He approached the convoy, found only families fleeing the violence, and let them pass. Yes, he was court-martialed. Yes, and he lost his rank. But those 47 civilians lived. Among them was a young girl who would grow up to become one of Earth's foremost peace negotiators. The ripple effects of one moment of conscience. Lysara's patterns shifted to what Nina recognized as deep interest. You're suggesting that individual ethical choices have strategic significance beyond their immediate context. I'm suggesting that strategy without ethics is merely efficient brutality, Nina replied. The projection changed again, this time showing the chaos of a field hospital during the siege of New Tokyo. My mother, Elena Reyes, was a combat medic with the Pacific Defense Force. When enemy soldiers were captured, wounded and dying, standing orders were to prioritize Alliance casualties. Medical supplies were scarce, every bandage precious. The room watched as the projection showed Elena moving between wounded soldiers, making no distinction between uniform colors. She treated whoever was closest to death first, regardless of allegiance. When questioned by her superiors, she simply said, "My oath as a healer supersedes my orders as a soldier." Professor Dragox's scales rippled, a sign of agitation. Noble sentiment, but wars are not won by healers. They are won by warriors willing to make hard choices. Are they? Nina challenged respectfully. Or are they perpetuated by those who see only enemies where they might see fellow beings? My mother's actions that day led to an unexpected consequence. One of the enemy soldiers she saved was the son of a high-ranking commander. When he recovered and was repatriated, he spoke of the mercy shown by Alliance medics. It became a turning point in peace negotiations. The discussion that followed was heated. Traditional military strategists among the students argued for the necessity of clear objectives and unwavering execution. Others, particularly those from species that had evolved beyond warfare, found merit in Nina's approach. The divide was not merely academic, but fundamental, touching on core beliefs about the nature of conflict and resolution. As the days progressed, Nina continued to present her family's stories, each one a thread in the tapestry of human ethical evolution. She spoke of her grandmother Rosa, who had hidden deserters from both sides of the Continental Divide War, believing that the courage to refuse to kill was as valuable as the courage to fight. She shared the story of her father, David, whose gift for languages had made him invaluable as a negotiator, ending border skirmishes through words rather than weapons. With each story, the resistance to her approach began to soften. Lysara was the first to openly support Nina's methodology. In Vorthian culture, she shared during one particularly intense discussion, "We have a saying, the mind that touches another carries both forward." Nina's approach allows us to touch the minds of those who faced these choices. It's more than academic. It's experiential. Even some of the more skeptical students began to reconsider. Quental, a hive mind representative whose species made decisions through collective consciousness, observed, "Individual ethics may seem insignificant to those of us who think collectively, but we must acknowledge that most species operate as individuals. Understanding their decision-making processes is crucial to preventing conflicts. The turning point came when Targun, who had been Nina's most vocal critic, made an unexpected confession. "I researched my own lineage after Nina's first presentation," he admitted, his forearms gesturing with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I discovered that my great ancestor, celebrated in our histories as a war hero, was responsible for what other species would call a massacre. Civilians were killed under his command. My family never speaks of this." The room fell silent. For a Bovary to publicly acknowledge ancestral shame was almost unheard of. Targun continued, "I realized that our histories, our family stories, they shape us in ways we don't always recognize. Perhaps there is wisdom in examining these personal narratives." Professor Dragox, who had maintained skeptical silence for days, finally spoke. "You challenged traditional pedagogy. Nina Reyes, in Draconid culture, we teach war ethics through the lens of victory and sacrifice. But perhaps," she paused, seeming to wrestle with long-held beliefs, "perhaps we have been teaching only half the story." It was then that Chancellor Irval made an unexpected announcement. "Given the unusual nature of Nina Reyes's submission and the discussions it has provoked, I am requiring a supplemental oral defense. This is not a punishment," he added, sensing the tension in the room, "but an opportunity. If personal narrative is to be considered a valid approach to teaching war ethics, it must withstand rigorous examination." The stakes were clear. Failure would mean more than a poor grade. It could mean expulsion from the academy, a return to Earth with her unconventional ideas unproven. Nina felt the weight of not just her own future, but the validation of her entire approach to understanding conflict and conscience. She spent the next week preparing with an intensity that surprised even her. Lysara helped by offering to telepathically share some of her own species' historical conflicts, showing how individual choices had shaped Vorthian evolution from a warlike race to empathic pacifists. Even Targun, in a gesture of solidarity, shared more about his own family's complex history, helping Nina understand how her human perspective might translate to other species' experiences. The night before the oral defense, Nina stood again at the observation deck, but this time she wasn't alone. A small group of students had gathered, representing a dozen different species, all drawn by the questions her approach had raised. They didn't speak. Some communicated in frequencies beyond human hearing anyway, but their presence was a comfort. "Are you ready?" Lysara asked. Her patterns shifting, and what Nina had learned was encouragement. "I don't know," Nina answered honestly. "How do you prove that stories matter as much as strategies? How do you quantify the value of conscience?" "Perhaps," offered Quental, their collective voice harmonizing with itself. "The question is not one of proof, but of understanding. Your species has a saying, 'Walk a mile in another's shoes.' You're asking us to walk in your family's memories. The value is in the journey, not the destination." The next morning, the Hall of Echoes was filled beyond capacity. Word of the unusual defense had spread throughout the academy, drawing faculty and students from departments beyond the School of Ethical Studies. The hall's unique architecture meant that every word spoken would resonate through the crystalline structure, creating harmonics that some species could interpret as emotional undertones. Chancellor Irval presided from his aqueous platform, his tentacles creating complex patterns that Nina had learned indicated deep concentration. Professor Dragox stood to one side, her scales neutral gray, revealing nothing of her thoughts. Other faculty members ringed the chamber, representing civilizations whose collective experience with warfare spanned millions of years. "Nina Reyes," the Chancellor began, his mental voice carrying formal weight. "You have submitted a family tree as a study in war ethics. Your classmates have presented analyses of great battles, strategic doctrines, and theoretical frameworks. Defend your choice." Nina stepped into the center of the chamber, feeling the weight of countless eyes upon her. She took a breath, centering herself as her mother had taught her before difficult moments. Then she began. "Ethics is not abstract," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It lives in the moments when beings must choose between what is easy and what is right. Every war is ultimately a collection of these moments, multiplied across thousands or millions of individuals. To understand war, we must understand these choices. To prevent war, we must understand what guides them." She activated the hall's projection system, but instead of showing her family's faces, she began with darkness. "Every student here has submitted reports analyzing conflicts from the outside as observers. But wars are not fought by observers. They are fought by participants, each carrying their own history, their own ethical framework shaped by generations of experience." The darkness gave way to light, revealing her great-uncle Marcus at the checkpoint in Meridian City. But this time, the projection was different. Nina had used the Academy's advanced simulation technology to recreate the moment in full sensory detail. The smell of smoke filled the air. The sound of distant explosions made some students flinch. The weight of decision hung palpable in the chamber. 30 seconds, Nina said. That's how long Marcus Reyes had to decide. Behind him, superior officers demanding obedience. Before him, vehicles that might contain enemies or might contain families. Military doctrine said to fire first, investigate later. But Marcus carried something else. The memory of his own family's flight from violence. The stories his grandmother told of soldiers who chose mercy. The projection shifted, showing the moment of choice from Marcus's perspective. The audience could feel his rapid heartbeat, the weight of the weapon in his hands, the conflict between training and conscience, when he stepped forward to investigate rather than fire, revealing the terrified faces of civilians. A collective exhale swept through the chamber. One moment, 47 lives, but more than that, 47 futures, 47 possibilities for peace rather than continued cycles of vengeance. Nina let the weight of that sink in before continuing. Traditional war ethics would analyze this as insubordination, a breakdown of command structure, but what if we analyzed it as evolution, the development of ethical frameworks that transcend immediate tactical advantage? Professor Dragox interjected. You speak of transcending tactical advantage as if it were a simple choice. In war, such choices can lead to defeat, to the destruction of everything one seeks to protect. Nina nodded, acknowledging the point. You're right, Professor, which is why my next example addresses exactly that concern. The projection shifted to the field hospital in New Tokyo. This time, the simulation included not just visual and auditory elements, but the chaos of triage, the scent of blood and antiseptic, the overwhelming pressure of too many wounded and too few supplies. My mother, Elena Reyes, made a different kind of choice. Not a single moment of decision, but a sustained commitment to a principle beyond military necessity. The simulation showed Elena moving between patients, her hands steady despite exhaustion, treating enemy and ally alike. She could have followed orders, prioritized alliance casualties, and no one would have questioned her. But she carried the oath she had taken as a healer, and the stories of her own mother, who had taught that suffering recognizes no uniform. The audience watched as Elena saved the life of an enemy soldier, using precious supplies that might have gone to her own forces. They felt her exhaustion, her doubt, the weight of choosing between competing ethical demands. And they saw the consequence. The same soldier, recovered, speaking to his own command about the mercy shown by Alliance forces. This is naive idealism, a faculty member from the Strategic Studies Department interrupted. Wars are not won by mercy but by strength, by the will to do what must be done for victory. Nina turned to face the challenger directly. And how has that philosophy served the galaxy? How many civilizations in this room have histories scarred by victories that became the seeds of future conflicts? My planet nearly destroyed itself following that logic. We survived only when enough individuals chose a different path. She activated the final sequence of her presentation. This time, the projection showed not the past, but potential futures, simulations based on different ethical choices in conflict situations. Consider two scenarios, she said. In the first, military forces follow traditional doctrine: overwhelming force, strategic advantage, victory at any cost. The simulation shows initial success, conquered territories, defeated enemies. But watch what happens over generations. The projection accelerated, showing the children of the defeated growing up with stories of humiliation and loss. The eventual resurgence of conflict, cycles of vengeance spanning centuries. Now the second scenario, where ethical choices like those my family made become not anomalies but policy, where mercy is seen not as weakness but as strategic wisdom. This simulation showed a different progression: former enemies becoming trading partners, shared medical facilities leading to technological exchange, the gradual dissolution of barriers between us and them. It wasn't without conflict, but the conflicts were smaller, resolved more quickly, less likely to spiral into total war. You're suggesting that personal ethics can reshape military doctrine? Chancellor Iraval's mental voice carried notes of deep interest. I'm suggesting that military doctrine divorced from personal ethics is incomplete, Nina replied. Every soldier, every commander, every decision-maker is a person first, carrying the accumulated wisdom or trauma of their lineage. Ignore that, and you ignore the fundamental drivers of conflict and resolution. Lysara stood, her patterns shifting in complex cascades of support. I would like to share something, she said, her mental voice resonating with unusual intensity. My own species' history supports Nina's thesis. We were once among the most warlike races in the galaxy. What changed us was not defeat, but encounter, meeting other species who showed us mercy when we expected annihilation. It was individuals making ethical choices that transformed our entire civilization. The admission sparked a wave of similar testimonies. Students and faculty from various species began sharing moments from their own histories where individual ethical choices had reshaped conflicts. Even Targun spoke again, his warrior pride tempered with newfound understanding. The Bovary teach that strength is the highest virtue, but perhaps we have misunderstood strength. It takes greater strength to choose mercy when tradition demands vengeance. As the discussion intensified, Chancellor Iraval raised a tentacle for silence. The ancient being's mental presence filled the chamber with unexpected weight. I must share something I have never revealed to this academy, he began, his thoughts heavy with centuries of regret. In my youth, I commanded fleets. I gave orders that resulted in the complete destruction of a rebel world. Every city, every settlement, every being who might have harbored sympathy for the rebellion. The chamber fell into shocked silence. The Chancellor's reputation as a philosopher of peace made this revelation staggering. For centuries, I justified this action as military necessity. The rebellion ended. Order was restored. But the guilt... His mental voice wavered. The guilt never left, because I realized too late that I had never asked why they rebelled, never considered that their grievances might have been legitimate, never imagined that there might have been another way. His attention focused on Nina with an intensity that made her feel as if she were being examined at a molecular level. Your approach, Nina Reyes, forces us to ask these questions. Not, how do we win, but why do we fight? Not, what is strategically optimal, but what can we live with? These are the questions I wish I had asked in my youth. Professor Dragok stepped forward, her scales now shifting through a spectrum of colors that indicated deep emotional processing. I have taught war ethics for 3 centuries, she said slowly. Always from the perspective of the victor, the strategist, the commander. But war is not experienced by abstractions. It is experienced by individuals. each making choices that ripple outward in ways we cannot always predict. She turned to Nina with something approaching respect. Your family tree is not merely a personal history. It is a challenge to how we teach, how we think about conflict and resolution. In Draconid culture, we have a saying, "The wisest warrior wins without fighting." Perhaps the wisdom lies not in avoiding conflict, but in understanding its true costs, not in casualties or territories, but in the erosion of conscience. The formal defense continued for hours, with challenges and responses, elaborations and clarifications, but the tide had turned. What had begun as skepticism transformed into genuine engagement with Nina's methodology. By the session's end, even the most traditional military ethicists were acknowledging the value of incorporating personal narrative into strategic studies. As the gathering concluded, Chancellor Yerval made his pronouncement. Nina Reyes, your defense has been more than adequate. It has been transformative. The Academy formally accepts your family tree as a valid and valuable approach to studying war ethics. More than that, we will be establishing a new course of study, narrative ethics and conflict resolution, based on your methodology. The relief Nina felt was overwhelming, but it paled beside the satisfaction of seeing her ideas validated. As students and faculty began to disperse, many approached her with their own stories, their own family histories that had shaped their understanding of right and wrong in conflict. Lysara's patterns glowed with what Nina had learned was deep joy. "You've done something remarkable," she said. "You've shown us that ethics isn't about rules imposed from above, but about wisdom carried forward from below." In the weeks that followed, Nina's family tree became more than just an assignment. It became a living document in the Academy's archives. Students from across the galaxy came to study it, not for the specific stories of the Reyes family, but for the methodology it represented. They began constructing their own ethical genealogies, tracing the moments when their ancestors had faced impossible choices and understanding how those choices shaped their own moral frameworks. The impact extended beyond the Academy. Military institutions across several sectors began incorporating personal narrative into their ethical training. The Bovary warrior schools, influenced by Targun's revelations, instituted programs where young warriors studied not just the victories but the moral complexities of their ancestors' choices. The Vorthians, already predisposed to empathic understanding, developed new therapeutic techniques for treating the trauma of veterans by helping them contextualize their experiences within larger family narratives. Nina found herself at the center of a quiet revolution in military ethics education. She received invitations to speak at institutions throughout the galaxy, to share not just her family's stories, but the underlying principle that understanding war means understanding warriors. And understanding warriors means acknowledging the full complexity of their moral existence. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came in a private meeting with Chancellor Yerval. The ancient being had requested to see her before the term ended, in his private chambers where the walls were lined with memories spanning millennia. "I want to show you something," he said, his mental voice gentle. He activated a projection, not of Nina's family, but of his own species' history. She watched as young Yerval, centuries ago, received the order to destroy the rebel world. But now she could see what the official histories had never recorded. His moment of hesitation, the doubt in his alien features, the path not taken. "I had options," he admitted. "Negotiation, blockade, targeted strikes. But I chose total destruction because it was doctrinally correct, strategically sound. I never considered the ethical dimension because I had been taught that ethics and strategy were separate domains. Your work, Nina Reyes, shows that they are inextricably linked." He paused, his tentacles creating patterns of deep contemplation. "You asked whether we teach ethics by enforcing rules or by telling the right stories. I believe now that rules without stories are empty, just as stories without principles are merely entertainment. The synthesis, principles embodied in narrative, rules given life through example, that is where true ethical education lies. as her time at the academy drew to a close. Nina stood once more at the observation deck, but now it was crowded with friends from a dozen worlds. They watched the binary sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, each processing the term's lessons in their own way. "What will you do now?" Lisara asked. Nina considered the question. She had offers from military academies, peace institutes, even governmental advisory positions. But her thoughts turned homeward, to Earth still healing from its wounds, to the generation growing up in the shadow of the last resource wars. "I think I'll go home," she said finally. "There are stories there that need telling, lessons that need learning. My family tree was just the beginning. Every human has similar stories, similar choices made by their ancestors. If we can understand those, truly understand them, maybe we can avoid repeating the mistakes." Targon, who had become an unexpected ally, performed a Bovary gesture of respect. "You have shown us that honor is not simple, that courage takes many forms. Your people are fortunate to have you as a teacher." As the group dispersed for the evening, Professor Dragox approached. The Draconid matriarch moved with deliberate grace, her expression unreadable. "I owe you an apology," she said simply, "and a debt. You have challenged centuries of my thinking, forced me to reconsider positions I thought were absolute. That is the greatest gift a student can give a teacher." She handed Nina a data crystal. "This contains the ethical genealogy of my own clan, dating back 3,000 years. I share it with you because your work has inspired me to look beyond the victories we celebrate to the choices we've forgotten. Perhaps understanding my species' individual stories will help in your future work." Nina accepted the crystal with deep gratitude, understanding the magnitude of trust it represented. As Professor Dragox departed, Nina realized that her unconventional assignment had achieved something she hadn't dared hope. It had created a bridge between species, a common language for discussing the most difficult aspects of sentient existence. The term ended with a ceremony in the Hall of Echoes, where Nina was awarded the Academy's Ethical Insight Medal. As she stood before the assembly, the medal's weight on her chest was nothing compared to the weight of responsibility she felt. She had opened a door to a new way of understanding conflict and conscience. Now it was up to her and others to walk through it. In her acceptance speech, Nina returned to the fundamental question that had driven her work. When we teach war ethics, do we shape behavior by enforcing rules, or by telling the right stories? I believe we do both, but we must start with stories. Rules tell us what we should do. Stories show us who we are, and who we might become. In the space between those 2 points lies the possibility of transformation. She looked out at the assembled faces, scales and fur, crystalline and gaseous, united in their attention. "My family tree taught me that every choice in war is also a choice about the future. My great-uncle's mercy created a peace negotiator. My mother's compassion opened diplomatic channels. These individual acts of conscience didn't end wars by themselves, but they created the conditions where peace became possible. As we leave here and return to our worlds, our militaries, our academies, I challenge each of us to look beyond doctrine to story, beyond strategy to conscience. The next time we face conflict, and we will face conflict, let us remember that we are not just tacticians or warriors. We are the sum of all who came before us, carrying their wisdom and their warnings. Let us choose to be ancestors worthy of remembrance." The applause that followed transcended species, clicks and whistles, color flashes and harmonic resonances, all expressing appreciation for a simple truth complexly stated. As Nina stepped down from the podium, she felt the weight of her family's legacy not as a burden but as a guide. The Reyes family tree had grown new branches in the halls of an alien academy, its roots now intertwined with the histories of a dozen civilizations. In the cycles that followed, Nina's influence spread in ways both subtle and profound. Military academies across the galaxy began incorporating personal narrative into their curricula. The concept of ethical genealogy became a standard tool in conflict resolution, helping negotiators understand not just the positions but the histories that shaped them. Veterans of countless conflicts found healing in tracing their own moral lineages, understanding their actions within the context of generational wisdom and trauma. Nina herself returned to Earth as promised, establishing the Institute for Narrative Ethics in the ruins of Old Berlin. The location was deliberate, a city that had seen the worst of human conflict and the best of human reconciliation. There, she trained a new generation of ethicists who understood that every strategic decision was also a human decision, every tactical choice a moral one. Years later, when the Galactic Council faced its greatest test, a conflict between two major civilizations that threatened to engulf entire sectors, it was Nina's students who provided the breakthrough. They didn't offer military solutions or strategic advantages. Instead, they compiled the ethical genealogies of key decision-makers on both sides, finding the moments in their ancestral histories where mercy had triumphed over vengeance, where understanding had prevented annihilation. The peace talks that followed were unlike any in galactic history. Instead of starting with positions and demands, they began with stories. Leaders shared the moments when their ancestors had chosen differently, had broken cycles of violence through individual acts of conscience. In those stories, they found common ground that no amount of strategic negotiation could have uncovered. As she watched the peace accords being signed, Nina thought of her family tree, now displayed in holographic form in museums across the galaxy. Each branch told a story of choice in the face of conflict, of ethics tested and sometimes found wanting, but always striving toward something better. It had started as a simple assignment, an unconventional approach to an academic requirement. It had become a new way of understanding the oldest of human problems: how to live with conscience in a world that often demands its sacrifice. The night after the accords were signed, Nina received a message from Chancellor Iraval. The ancient being was nearing the end of his life cycle, but his mental voice carried the same clarity it had decades before. "I have lived to see the fruit of the seed you planted," he transmitted across the light years. "Wars are still fought, but they are fought by beings who understand the weight of their choices, who carry the wisdom of their ancestors alongside their weapons. That is the most we can hope for, not the end of conflict, but its transformation through conscience." Nina stood on the observation deck of her institute, looking up at the stars that held her former classmates, now scattered across the galaxy, each carrying forward the lesson of the family tree. That ethics is not abstract but lived, not imposed but inherited, not perfect but evolving. In the end, the question was not whether to teach through rules or stories, but how to weave them together into a tapestry strong enough to hold the weight of conscience in times of war. As she turned to go inside, where a new cohort of students waited to learn not just the tactics of conflict, but the ethics of choice, Nina touched the small pendant she wore, a gift from her mother, who had received it from her mother. A chain of memory and meaning stretching back through generations of difficult choices made with imperfect wisdom but genuine conscience. Tomorrow, she would share another story from her family tree. Another moment when an individual chose conscience over convenience, mercy over doctrine, and, perhaps, in some future she would never see. Those stories would echo in the choices of beings she had never met, in conflicts she could never imagine, a ripple of ethical consideration spreading across the cosmos. Proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon against war is not superior strategy, but superior storytelling. The stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the struggles of the beings who lived beneath them. But in academies and war rooms, in peace negotiations and private moments of decision, the lessons of Nina's family tree lived on, a reminder that every choice in war is also a choice about who we are and who we choose to become. And in that choosing, in that constant struggle between what is easy and what is right, lay the hope for a galaxy where conflict might never disappear, but where conscience would never be forgotten.